Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Humanities, SOH, Certificate Programs, Certificate in the Teaching of English as a Second Language, CTE, Compulsory, CTE 0 to the Structure of English, Block-1 English and its Varieties, Unit-1 Native and Non-Native Varieties of English, 1.0 Objectives. This unit will help you to understand the dynamic and variable nature of language, get an insight into the important distinction between native and non-native varieties of language, appreciate the difference between native language, second language and foreign language, become aware of the different contexts in which English is used and the functions it performs. 1.1 Introduction. Language is neither static nor homogeneous. All languages show variation along different dimensions. When one talks about the English language or any other language, or when one reads a grammatical description of one language or the other, the impression one gets is that language is a monolithic, homogeneous entity. The fact, however, is that all languages show variation. The variation can be along the dimensions of time or space. Thus, English today is different from what it was a few hundred years ago. Similarly, along the dimension of space, we know languages vary from one place to another. American English is different from British English, and within British English, there is regional variation as one moves from the south of England to the northern parts. Languages also vary along other dimensions with social class, sex, education, etc. As a matter of fact, such labels as Chaucer's English, 20th century English, Yorkshire English, Queen's English, Standard British English, Cockney English, etc. are evidence of the fact that rather than being a homogeneous, invariant entity, language is essentially dynamic and variable. 1.2 Native varieties of English. 1.2.1 Speech community. Native language. It is useful to begin our discussion of native varieties of English with the term language community or speech community. The language community is a group of people who regard themselves as using the same language. Various other interesting definitions of language community or speech community are available, but the crucial point is that all members of such a group consider themselves not only as using the same language but also as being born into or born with the same language. Thus, one can speak of the Chinese speech community, the German speech community, the Hindi speech community, the English speech community, and so on and so forth. All members of such communities, irrespective of where they are, who they are, and at what point of time they are located, identify with a given language. The language we identify with in this manner is generally referred to as the native language. The language is native also in the sense that the person who identifies with it gets his first cognition of the world through this language, acquires it before any other language, and continues to owe allegiance to it. That is why it is also often called mother tongue or first language. The term native language or mother tongue has its counterpart in the term native land, which refers to the nation or country one identifies with. We shall have occasion to return to this term in a different section of this unit. We may note that it is possible for an individual to belong simultaneously to two or more speech communities and learn two or more languages as native languages. 1.2.2 Variation across time. Now, speech communities or language communities are not undifferentiated. Although members of such communities see themselves as belonging to and using the same language, these members are distributed across time and space. Thus, those who may be considered members of the English community or native speakers of English have to be looked at along these two dimensions of time and space. The native speakers of English living in the 14th century used a variety of English which was very different from the variety of English used in the 18th century, which, in turn, was very different from the variety of English used in the present century. A comparison of texts belonging to these three periods would make the point very clear. Languages change over time. English today is not the same as it was 200 years ago, but for a member of the English language community, English was a native language in the 14th century as much as it is the native language for such members of the community today. This is the historical or diachronic perspective of looking at language varieties. It is customary to speak of Old English, Middle English, Modern English, and so on. Within modern English, one can recognize differences between 20th century English, 18th century English, Elizabethan English, etc. These are all labels to refer to native language varieties across time. To make you aware how English has evolved, let us look at some major changes in pronunciation since late Middle English. 1.2.3 Variation across space. However, if one were to keep time constant and focus, say, on modern-day English, I would find variation depending on where one is located in relation to space. All languages have regional varieties. It is customary to refer to such varieties as dialects or regional varieties. The English speech community is spread over a vast area, and members of this community show a marked difference in their language. The English used in Britain, for example, shows interesting patterns of variation as one moves from one region or area to another. Thus one gets such varieties as Southeast Midland dialect, South Central Midland, dialed, Yorkshire dialect, and so on. Thus what you call a BS at us in standard English is actually called a bus in Yorkshire English, with you being pronounced as you and not as a, is roughly equal to a. The important thing to remember is that from among such regional varieties or dialects, one variety comes to be recognized as standard language. In England, for example, the Southeast Midland dialect has come to be recognized as standard, while the other regional varieties continue to be referred to as dialects. Once a regional variety comes to be recognized as the standard, it receives institutional support. Example, educational institutions teach it, propagate it, and promote it. The media uses it, and most administrative agencies support and use it. It gains prestige and recognition and becomes synonymous with the national language. Thus, when we talk about British English, we generally have in mind Standard British English. This standard form or standard variety forms the basis of all descriptions of the language, grammars, dictionaries, thesauruses, etc. Another interesting dimension of the spatial distribution of native language is that often languages come to be associated with political entities known as nationals. Thus, the English language, operating as a native language, has come to be associated with national entities such as Australia, Canada, and the USA. At this level of variation, one can then talk of Australian English, British English, Canadian English, American English, and so on. The interesting thing is that these different national varieties are all native varieties, and the different labels they can are more indicative of different nationhoods rather than any substantial differences in form. Having said that, one must hasten to add that there are differences between American English and British English, or British English and Australian English, as reflected in the spoken form and, to a lesser degree, in the written form, but these differences are generally not taken note of. 1.2.4 Dialect and accent. Whether or not one speaks standard English, one will certainly speak with an accent. It is wrong to believe that some people speak with an accent while others do not. The fact is that every language user speaks with an accent. It is a different matter that some speakers may have particularly strong or easily recognizable accents. The term accent, in its technical sense, is restricted to aspects of pronunciation which help us identify a speaker in terms of where she is from, regionally or socially. Accent needs to be distinguished from dialect, which refers to features of grammar and vocabulary, as well as to aspects of pronunciation. For example, the sentence "you don't know what you are talking about" will generally appear the same whether spoken with an American or a Scottish accent. Both speakers will be using standard English forms but have different pronunciations. However, the sentence "Ye demai ken wit ye havrin about" has the same meaning as the first sentence, but represents what a person who speaks a Scottish dialect of English might say. There are, as you will notice, differences of pronunciation, ken, havrin, and a different grammatical form, dine instead of don't, dot, 1.2.5 variation by social class, native languages, English in this case, also vary according to social classes. While spatial distribution gives us different regional dialects, socio-economic differences lead to social dialects or sociolects. You must have come across such descriptive labels as speech of the aristocracy, upper class speech, language of the man in the street, etc. What actually happens is that in any community or society where there are sharp class distinctions, language tends to reflect these distinctions. Present-day American society, for example, shows interesting differences between varieties used by the upper middle classes and the lower working classes. In England, where class distinctions are more sharp than in the USA, differences in sociolects are more pronounced and more easily recognized. We quote below an extract from Halliday et al. To give you an idea of these two dimensions of native varieties of English. The dialect structure of English today can be represented by a pyramid. The vertical plane represents class, the horizontal one region. At the base there is wide regional differentiation, widest among the agricultural workers and the lower paid industrial workers. As one moves along the socio-economic scale, dialectal variety according to region diminishes. Finally, at the apex there is no regional differentiation at all. This regionally neutral variety of English, often known as RP, carries prestige and may be acquired at any stage. Certain institutions, notably the preparatory and public schools, create, as part of their function, conditions in which it can be learned. The speaker of this form of English has many social and economic advantages. Halliday, M.A.K. et al., The Linguistic Sciences and Language Teaching, 1964. London. Longman, Green and Co. p.86. We may note that received pronunciation, RP, is not really neutral, even regionally. It is associated predominantly with the south of England. It is of course true that it is more a marker of an elite social class, 1.26 variation according to use. So far we have discussed native varieties in terms of the users of language and their location in time and space, as well as in the social structure. However, language also varies according to the uses to which it is put. This variation of language according to its function is called registral variation, and such varieties are known as registers. In any given language community, the members use language in a variety of situations, for a large variety of purposes, and to perform a wide variety of functions. The one Latif 6 speaker, initiatively and by training, is aware of the conventions that govern the appropriate form of language for a particular use or function. This appropriate form is what register refers to. Certain words, word combinations and grammatical forms are appropriate for one function, while certain other words, other word combinations and grammatical forms are appropriate for another function. A look at the following examples will make the point clear. 1. Medical staff strike work to Kapil Rip through Australian batting. 3. Add 3 tablespoonfuls of sugar and mix well. 4. All donations are exempt from income tax. 5. Please speak. 6. For necessary action. 7. The use of pigments and subtle shades. 8. Power, fuel efficiency, and sleek looks. 9. Lower necklines and higher hem 1 lines. 10. The gas was passed through a vertical glass tube containing potassium phosphate. Anyone familiar with English would immediately recognize that examples 1 to 10 belong to different registers. While sentence 1 is clearly a newspaper headline, 2 is part of a report, written or spoken, on cricket. Sentence 3 obviously is part of instructions typical of a recipe, while 4 belongs to an appeal or donations for a charity. 5 and 6 are typical noting from official files. While sentence 7 belongs to a comment on the art of painting, 8 appears to be part of an advertisement. Sentence 9 belongs to a comment review of fashions and clothing, while 10 clearly belongs to a chapter on some scientific or industrial process. It is possible to quote any number of sentences or passages to show how language varies according to use. Such language variation is not merely a matter of lexical differences. Although some words typically belong to certain types of language use, registers are marked by different word collocations or combinations, e.g. tablespoonful, mix well, for necessary action, and certain grammatical features. Notice the interesting construction of sentence 1 or the use of impersonal passive construction in 10. By now it has been recognized that the forms of language vary according to the topic, field or subject of discourse, the manner, formal or informal, and whether a discourse is written or spoken, mode of discourse. These three determine variations in language by use, i.e. they determine different registers. 1.3 Non-native varieties of English. 1. 3.1 The spread of English. In the preceding section we have discussed the native varieties of English and brought in such terms as standard language, regional dialect, social dialect, accent, and registers. As one moves away from the contexts in which English is used by a native community of speakers, e.g. England, the USA, Canada, and Australia, one observes that English is widely used in different parts of the world where it is not a native language. As a matter of fact, if we look at English in the global perspective, we find that there are many times more non-native speakers users of English than there are native speakers. 1. Estimate states that while there are 500 million native speakers of English, there are about to 1 billion non-native speakers of English spread over different parts of the world. Kachru, 1994. We reproduce below a diagram based on Kachru's work to show the spread of English worldwide. This will give you an idea of the wide dispersal and distribution of English, especially its non-native varieties. 13.2 Implications of the term non-native. While discussing the native varieties of English, we had clarified what we mean by native language or native speakers of a language. In contrast, the term non-native means the forms, uses and functions of English in those parts of the world where it is not the native language or first language or mother tongue of the people. The term non-native implies the presence of some other native language. A German user of English has the German language or some variety of German as his native language. An African user of English has, perhaps, Swahili as his native language, just as an Indian user of English may have Hindi or Tamil or Bangla as his first or native language. One important implication of this is that these users of English already possess one native language which, at least theoretically, should be sufficient for them for all their communicative needs. English, therefore, constitutes for them an additional language. Now, this additional language can be learned at different stages of life. It can be learned for different purposes, aims, and goals. It can be made use of for different functions, and it can be learnt differently, i.e., with different degrees of proficiency. We need to elaborate this further. The German, the African, the Indian all learn English as a non-native language addition to an already existing native language. More important, however, is the fact that they all learn it with different motivations, for different purposes, and in different socio-cultural contexts. While the Germans, the Chinese, or the Japanese learn English as a foreign language, people in countries such as India, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, or the Philippines learn it as a second language. We shall have more to say about these two terms in a later section of this unit. Here we would like to stress that whether one learns English as a second or a foreign language, one does it in a socio-cultural context different from the one that obtains in America or England or Australia. This non-native socio-cultural context has an important bearing on the kinds of non-native varieties of English that arise globally. Furthermore, because all non-native speakers of English already know and use their native language, their English tends to be influenced by their respective native languages. This influence is most prominent in pronunciation. However, even vocabulary and grammar tend to show traces of this influence. 1.3.3 Influence of native language on non-native varieties of English. As stated earlier, non-native learners and users of English already possess and function with their own respective native languages. This means that when a German or a Japanese learns English, some features of his native German or Japanese language are carried over into his English. You must have observed how easily people are able to identify non-native speakers of English in terms of their native languages. This easy identification is possible because non-native speakers use a form of English that has several features of German or Japanese. Speaking with an accent, foreign accent, German accent, etc. are some of the labels we use to characterize this phenomenon. The sounds, stress patterns, and intonation patterns of the non-native speaker's first language are carried over into their English. This carry-over is often referred to as transfer, and from the pedagogical point of view, this constitutes some kind of interference in the learning and use of native-like English. This interference and transfer gives rise to various non-native varieties of English, which are distinct from native varieties of English. Thus, one can talk about Japanese English, German English, Indian English, African English, etc. The phenomenon of transfer or interference can be viewed from another perspective also. The non-native learner-user of English can be seen as one who is trying to learn and approximate to standard British or standard American English. She succeeds in his endeavor to a greater or lesser extent depending on a. where she learns English, b. why she learns English, c. the degree of motivation SOH has for learning English, d. the uses to which she puts his English, e. the persons with whom she uses English, and f. the opportunities she has for exposure to native varieties of English. Since all these are variable in nature, the non-native speaker learner of English never achieves total or complete approximation to native standards. She therefore has command of and uses an interlanguage which is not standard British or standard American English but a learner's variety, a non-native approximation. It is a different matter altogether that some non-native speakers, through rigorous training, high degree of motivation, and frequent exposure to and interaction with native speakers of English, become fluent and proficient users of native-like standard varieties. They are the exception rather than the rule. The majority of non-native varieties are therefore interlanguages ranging from near-native standard to minimal, heavily marked, and restricted varieties of English. We can round off this part of our discussion by stating that non-native varieties can be viewed in terms of space, as foreign varieties with features of the languages of the region. They are used in viz. German English, French English, Japanese English, etc., or in terms of approximation to native standards, depending on the factors listed above, i.e., interlanguage, Englishes ranging from the most rudimentary and minimal to the highly proficient, near-native variety. The former variety would be characterized by limited vocabulary, limited grammatical structures, heavy or very prominent accent, and rather restricted functional uses. The latter, on the other hand, would be characterized by near-native pronunciation, extensive vocabulary, control of most of the grammatical structures, and wide-ranging functions. We can designate these two kinds of non-native varieties as efficient, deficient, or as educated, uneducated. It is obvious that the efficient or educated, non-native varieties would include different registers too. Notice that all that we have said about an Indian learning English is equally true of an English all trying to learn, say, Hindi. The following two diagrams would, it is hoped, make the distinction between native and non-native varieties abundantly clear. 1.4 English as a foreign and as a second language. From your reading of 1.3, it must have become clear that globally English is perhaps one of the most widely learned and used languages. People in different parts of the world learn and use English. However, there is a marked difference in the roles that non-native varieties of English play in different countries of the world. While in certain parts of the world English is learnt and used as a foreign language, e.g., Germany, Russia, Japan, Turkey to name a few, in certain other parts of the world English is learnt and used as a second language, example, several countries in South Asia and Africa. The difference between foreign language and second language can be easily appreciated if you consider for a moment the learning and use of German or French or Italian or Spanish in the Indian context, contrasted with the learning and use of English. Languages such as German, French, Spanish or Italian are learnt as a part of one's personal enterprise, out of personal choice, aspirations and ambitions. These languages are foreign not only in that they do not belong to the Indian nation, that is why English too is a foreign language, but more importantly, we call them foreign languages because we learn them for very restricted purposes. Perhaps we wish to learn more about France, or we wish to acquaint ourselves with the French culture, history, and literature, or perhaps we hope, someday, to go to France and in order to make our stay fruitful and rewarding we learn the French language. Other people learn Italian or German or Chinese for similar purposes. In such cases, where a language is learned and used for restricted, individual purposes, we call it a foreign language. These foreign languages, while being available to us if we should wish to learn them, are not an integral part of the socio-cultural and linguistic context in which we live. These languages do not form a part of our community's verbal repertoire, and there is no social or educational pressure on us to learn these languages, in the sense that our daily routine does not require that we learn these languages either for education or for interregional communication or for personal interaction with other people within the country. We do not have French, for instance, as a medium of instruction or as a requirement for a job. We do not publish newspapers and books in French, nor do we make public speeches in French. French, therefore, is a foreign language for us in the sense that it is foreign to our socio-cultural, educational, and administrative contexts. On the other hand, English in India and several other countries of South Asia and Africa, is learned and used as a second language. We call it a second language and not a foreign language because it has become a part of our national and socio-cultural reality. English is as much a part of the Indian linguistic scene as any other Indian language. If we consider our educational setup, our administrative and bureaucratic contexts, our trade and commerce, our judicial setup, and even our personal communicative needs, we find that the need for English can be discernible in every sphere. There is a constant social pressure to lean and use English, and our education system is organized and structured to teach English at different stages. We lean one not only English but we also learn many subjects through English. Several of our creative writers write in English. When such a situation obtains, it is A, qualitatively different from that of a foreign language, and B, quantitatively different too, because an ever increasing number of people learn and use English. At the same time, English is not a first language or native language in India. Within the Indian context, we all learn and use one or more Indian languages, Hindi or Tamil or Bangla or Marathi, etc. This fact makes English a second language. Another thing that has to be remembered is that English, in addition to being widely used by Indians, enjoys official recognition as associate official language and as a linked language. In second language contexts such as ours, English becomes associated with better education, better job opportunities, better interregional mobility and communication and higher social status. Similar situations obtain in other countries of Africa and South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Kenya, etc. 1.5 Summary. After reading this unit, you have realized that despite pedagogical norms that we as teachers of English tend to follow, language is actually a dynamic entity, constantly subject to change. This has probably changed your worldview of language, and the insight that you have gained will help you understand your students better. Moreover, you have also been made to appreciate the difference between native and non-native varieties of English, English as a second and foreign language, and finally the functions and status that English enjoys in a second language context.